Greetings, this is Robert Cain, better known on the internet as Arcane Code. I'm a Microsoft Data Platform MVP and the owner of Arcane Training and Consulting. In this video, we're going to see how to take an on-premises SQL Server database and transport it up to Azure SQL using PowerShell code. The first question everybody always asks is, are the samples available for download? Absolutely. Just go to github.com/arcanecode and look in my PowerShell folder. In there, you're going to find a lot of my different PowerShell sample code. The particular ones you're going to be seeing today are in the MVP24 folder. Let me set the stage here. The scripts that you're seeing are ones that I developed to help me out as I'm developing a new course for Pluralsight on Azure Data. In addition, as I run this code, I'm going to be using the hotkeys a lot. I'm going to be using F8 to run sections of code, and I'll be using Control-R to swap back and forth from the code window to the command window. All right, so the first thing I do is just get a reference to my local directory, and we've executed that. Now I have a script that has some common functions, and we're going to look at that in a moment, but I'm going to go ahead and run the script so that it's in memory. Now the first thing I need to do is connect to Azure. In order to connect to Azure, I have a little cmdlets set up. Here's the function, and it's pretty straightforward. I'm going to admit, kind of lazy. The reason I did it this way is so that I wouldn't have to keep typing in my really long 20-some-odd character password that is just gibberish. So what I do is I pass in the path and the name of my password file, and then I copy that into memory, and I use set clipboard so that when I actually log in, I can just do a Control-V. Now, obviously, if you're in a production situation, keeping your password around in a text file is a really dumb idea. But for something like this, where I've just got it in a virtual machine and it's well protected and I get rid of the file after I do these kinds of demos, it just makes it very convenient. The key to this thing is the Add Azure RMA account, and that's what actually brings up the screen that lets me do the login. Okay, so let's execute this line of code. And you're going to see my Microsoft Azure login pops up. Now, my email address is not on the domain, so when I hit enter, it's going to redirect me to the sign-in page. And rather than having to key in my 20-character gibberish password, I can just hit Control-V and it will log me in. The next thing I need to do is set the account that I want to use. I have 3 different Azure accounts. So I just use this little simple switch construct, and it will set up the subscription name, and then it will set up some other variables that I'm using that are dependent upon which account I'm using. So we'll just highlight this, and for this particular demo, I'm using my Azure free trial account. Now, obviously, if you only have one account, you can do away with this little framework and just assign the variables as you want them. So we'll come down here and highlight this and run it. The next thing I have are some variables that are going to be used in this particular setup. I have my location. For me, South Central US is the closest. I have the database name that I'm going to import. Later, I'll be creating a firewall, and I'm just going to call the rule name allow sum. I'm setting a default query timeout. This is 500,000 seconds, which I realize is really high, but I've got really poor internet right now. This is the path to where my SQL file is going to be located at. Another thing you're going to need to know is what database type do you want on your Azure SQL database. There are several options. The simplest is basic. However, the Wide World Importers database has features that are only supported in Azure SQL Premium. So I'm going with Premium, and under the service objective, I'm going with the simplest level of P1. Be sure to consult with the Azure Online documentation to see what features are and are not supported on Azure SQL at the various levels. The next set of variables I'm going to use are what is the username for my SQL server that I'm going to use to access it, and where do I want the password. Again, I'm using the trick of putting my password in a file for this demo, otherwise I would have to manually key it in, and then all y'all would see what my password is, which would even be a worse idea than sticking my password in a file. I read the password out of the file, and the next to the last thing I do is I set up an array of SQL scripts. Now what this is after we deploy our database, there are often SQL files that you may want to execute as kind of maybe a cleanup or to add additional users, additional routines, etc. Each element in the array is just the name of a SQL file that I'll be loading and executing later. I put a second one in here, commented out, just so you can see that this is indeed an array and that we can do multiples, but there's only one I'm actually going to execute for purposes of this demo. So we'll run all of this and then go on to the next step. Next, I'm going to call a series of these little helper functions I've created. The first one, set PS subscription, will change our current subscription to the one that we indicated earlier back in that switch statement I showed you. The next one will go out and create a new resource group to hold everything if that resource group does not exist. If it does exist, it'll just keep going and assume that we know what we're doing. After that, I call another function, new PS storage account, to go create the storage account. The storage account will be needed to upload our samples to. The storage account will be used to upload our database file to. It will also hold the files for our Azure SQL Database. Finally, I'm going to create a storage container within the storage account. It is the storage container that will actually hold everything. So let's go look at those. The first function is set PS subscription, has one parameter, the name of the subscription. I come down and I use the get Azure RM context to determine which subscription are we in. I compare that to the name that was passed in. If they're the same, we're already running under it. I just threw up a little write verbose that says, hey, you're already set to that, and go on. Otherwise, down here at the bottom, I'll do a set Azure RM context to change the subscription to the name that was passed in. Again, this is very useful if you have multiple subscriptions you have to work with. After that is my new PS resource group function. Again, we pass in the resource group name and what location, geographic location, we want to put it in. I have a little write verbose just to let people know what's going on. We then call get Azure RM resource group for the resource group name. Normally, it would error out if it doesn't exist. That's why we use error action silently continue to say, keep going, don't throw up an error. If it does not exist, what's going to happen is the variable is going to have a null in it. So we then compare it to null. If it is null, we say, oh, this resource group must not exist, and we'll use new Azure RM resource group to create it. The next function we're going to look at is new PS storage account. Here we pass in the storage account name that we want to create and the resource group name and location that it should go in. I then call get Azure RM storage account, passing in the resource group name and storage account name that we want to create. I'm again using the silently continue error action trick, and it returns the results to SA exists. If the variable is null, it means the storage account does not exist, and we will go create it. So we've jumped back here, and we'll just go run all of this to take care of the subscription, resource group, storage account, and storage container. The beautiful thing about this is if our script crashes or we want to start it over and these things already exist, you won't have to deal with all of the errors that would normally occur from trying to create storage containers or storage accounts that already exist. Okay, that part completed. We now have our storage container set up. So how do we actually get our database up to the server to be imported? Well, the methodology for that is to create a backpack file. A backpack file is a representation of both the database structures and the data in the database. You can create a backpack file through SQL Server Management Studio. I'm also going to show you in a moment how to create it using PowerShell code. Now, if you're in a situation where you need to generate that backpack file on a daily basis, you're going to want to use the code I'm about to show you. However, I'm working with a static database that is for demonstration purposes as part of this course, so I don't need to recreate it every day. As a matter of fact, I've got multiple versions of it depending upon what I'm doing. So I've already generated the backpack externally, and I just set a reference to where it's located. Here you can see I have a code line that says, this is the smallest version, and it is in the backpack small wide world importers.backpack. Just so that you can see the actual code, I have another area here where I'm setting up my database name. Then I'm setting a target file variable, and that's basically going to be where do I want to create the backpack file and what do I want to name it. The actual backpack file can be created using the SQL package command line tool that comes with most versions of SQL Server. Now, there are a few recent versions of SQL, such as 2017, where the SQL package may be a separate download, so check for yourself. You also have to alter this path depending upon where your SQL package is installed at. Now that it knows the location of SQL package, there are certain parameters that need to be placed after SQL package in order for it to execute. So I have my action. I'm telling it I want to do an export. I'm giving it the name of my server. Here I'm just using the local host. I'm giving it my database name. Where do I want to put it? And yes, go overwrite if it's already there. I then create a single command line where I combine SQL package and my params. And then I use invoke expression to actually go run this, and it will go out and create my backpack file for me. Now, again, I don't need to do it here because I've already got the backpack created, but if you need to go create yours on a regular basis, here's the code how to do it. Now that I have a backpack created, I can now go upload it to the server. To do that, I've got another helper function. This is one I use a lot called set ps blob content. I basically pass in the name of the file that I want to upload, what the resource group is, what the storage account name is, and what container that I want it placed in. Let's go take a look at that function. After my function declaration, I basically go through and set up all the parameters that we've just shown you. Now, a couple that I didn't explicitly declare was the timeout, and I have a default timeout of 500,000 seconds. And then I have a switch called force, which I'll show you momentarily. So we'll scroll down. First thing I need to do is find the storage account key, which is based on the account name. There's a built-in commandlet called get Azure RM storage account key. I just pass in the resource group name and the account name, and that gives me the key. Once I have the key, I can go through and I can get the context. The context is a combination of the storage account name and the storage account key, and it returns a value that PowerShell can then have to tell Azure where to put things. With that done, I'll use the local file variable to go get the file object. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set a flag that assumes that we need to upload the file. The next thing is I'm going to go get a reference to the existing file if there is one. So get Azure Storage Blob, I tell it what the container is, what the context is, and then I'm going to pipe that through where object to filter out for the current file name. And this is just an alternate way of doing the error action silently continue that we did before. I just kind of wanted to show you a slightly different way of handling this type of thing. I then go, well, if the Azure file is not null, in other words, there is a file by that name, then I'm going to get the length. And if the length of the Azure file and the length of the local file are the same, I'm going to assume it's the same file. And I'm going to set my upload flag to false because there's no need to go upload a file that's already there. This can be a huge time saver if you've got a large file and a slow internet connection like I do. Now let's come down here. We're going to see where that force flag comes into play. If the user passed the -force switch, it's going to reset that upload flag to true to force it to upload, even if it thinks they're already the same. Now comes the actual magic. We're going to come down. I said, well, if you are wanting to upload, we'll be doing the set Azure Storage Blob Content, passing it all the relevant information, and waiting for it to execute. The biggest issue I've run into when using this commandlet is timeouts, especially on a large file. So that's why I've wrapped this in a try-catch block. I throw the error, and then I use a break to try and stop script execution. All right, with that done, we'll come over here, and let's actually run this. And momentarily, it should start the upload. And there we go, all done. Finally, we are ready to actually create our Azure SQL Server. Yay! Okay, the first thing we have to do is generate a secure password, and we're going to create a credential object to do that with, which is a combination of the username and our password. We would then come down and we're going to see if the SQL Server already exists. We're going to use the same method we've done so many times before. In this case, we're going to get a list of all the SQL servers and we're going to pipe them through where object to only get the one for the particular server name we want to use. If that comes back as null, we know that we actually need to go create that SQL server, and we'll use new Azure RM SQL Server, which is actually a pretty simple command. You just give it the resource group, and then you give it what you want to name your server. That's what's in the $server name variable. We tell it where we want to store it at, in other words, the geographic location, and we give it the credentials that we'll use to log into our brand new SQL server. So let's go run all of this. And there we go. Our server is now created. Now I'll admit we did a little time lapse there to make it run really quickly. In reality, this took a couple of minutes, but it wasn't bad. So now we have our beautiful new Azure SQL Server set up. The problem is nothing can get to it right now. That's because by default, Azure sets up a firewall around it. What we need to do is to create a rule that will allow traffic into and out of our firewall. Earlier, we declared a variable that's going to hold the name for a firewall rule. So now we want to go see if that guy already exists. So we're going to use get Azure RM SQL Server Firewall Rule, pass in the resource group name and the server. Then we're going to pass in what the name of the rule is. And then we're going to use the error action silently continue method. If we don't do this and the rule does not exist, we're going to get a big red error message. With error action silently continue, it's just going to return a null. And down here, we're going to say, well, if the exists is equal to null, it means the rule does not exist. And we're going to use new Azure RM SQL Server Firewall Rule commandlet to go create it. Again, we're going to pass in the resource group, server, firewall rule, and then we pass the IP address range. Now here I'm leaving it wide open. That's to make it easy for you when you want to download this code and play with it, that you don't have to worry about trying to figure out what your specific IP address is. In a real world situation though, I would definitely lock this down with just the single address or the short range of addresses that you're going to use within your organization. So we'll highlight all of this and run it. And there we go. Checked for the rule and created it. All right, we're almost to the finish line. We have created our resource group, our storage account information. We created our backpack file and uploaded it to our storage account. We created an Azure SQL Server and configured the firewall. Now we're finally ready to take that backpack file and turn it into an actual database on Azure SQL. The first thing we have to do though is check to see if the database already exists. If it does, then running the command to turn the backpack into the database will fail. So in this case, I'm going to check to see if it exists using get Azure RM SQL Database. And again, I'm using the where object technique, but I'm doing something a little different here. If the exists is not equal to null, it means the database already exists. In this case, I'm taking the assumption that I want to get rid of it and then replace it with the newer version. However, that may not be what you want to do. You may actually want to just skip this and leave it alone, so do whatever is appropriate for your logic. But here I'm going to use remove Azure SQL RM Database. We'll give it the resource group, server name, database name, and I'm going to use -force to force it to go away without asking me a bunch of "are you sure" questions. Next up, I need to actually get the storage account in context so that I can get the URI to the backpack file where it's stored in our Azure container. I've got two helper functions I created, get PS storage account key and get PS storage context. I return those, and with those I can get the storage URI. Now I can finally start the import process. I would come down here, and I'm going to use the new Azure RM SQL Database import. We give it the standard information, resource group, server name, database name. We're telling it we're going to use the storage access key to get to our storage URI, and then we give it that key and that storage URI. I then need to authenticate myself to the server, so I'm going to use the username and password for my credential object. I now give it what edition that I want to create this as. If you remember, I had options such as basic and premium. I'm going with the value stored in my edition variable, which is premium. My service objective name was the P1 you saw earlier. And then I said, well, here's how big I think this is going to get up to. And so I've now given myself a maximum size. So let's go run this so that we can kick off the process. And you'll notice it said the beginning import. If I return, you're going to see there's my right host beginning import, and this returned immediately. However, the new Azure RM SQL Database import can take a while. So below this, I've created a little loop that will keep going through and checking on the status of my import. There is a commandlet called get Azure RM SQL Database import export status. It's probably one of the longest named commandlets out there. And essentially what I do is take that status and see what its value is. If the status is still in progress, I know it's still working on it. So I display a nice, helpful little information with the current date and time and the message. And at the end of that line, you can see that little symbol. That's not a dot on your screen or dirt that you need to wipe off. That is actually the backtick symbol, which is the line continuation character. So I display the helpful, hey, I'm still working message, and I go into a sleep to make this pause for 10 seconds. When that status message finally changes, it says, oh, you're done. I stop the timer that I created earlier. Up here, I've got a timer that I started in order to just track how long this actually takes. So let's come down here and let's run all this so that you can see it in action. Here you can see running progress 5%. And in a few seconds, it should show this again. And so it'll just keep doing this while it's working on the import process. So we're going to go into fast forward motion to zip through these little messages, because this can take a little while depending on the size of the database. And there we go. We finished. Now, this does an odd thing. I've seen it go 5%, 5%, 5%, 15%, 15%. Boom, I'm done. So I don't know what it's doing for that other 85%, but there we go. It's done. We can see we succeeded. And I even display the elapsed time was in real time 2 minutes and 35 seconds. But this was actually a very small database. This last step is optional, but I often find myself needing to execute scripts after my database is deployed. You can think of these as post-deployment scripts. Earlier, I placed a list of the SQL scripts that I want to execute into the array variable $SQL scripts. So I enter a little for each here. I display a message that says, hey, I'm about to execute this. I create a variable which holds both the path and the name of the SQL script that I want to grab. I then use get content to load the contents of that SQL file into the $SQL variable. One thing that I want to point out is at the end of get content, I use the -raw. It's very important that you do this. By default, get content will take the contents of a file and turn it into an array. That's not what we want in this case. We just want one big text string, and that's what -raw will do for us. Then I'm going to call invoke-SQL command. Invoke-SQL command is what you use to execute queries against a server. Now this could be an Azure SQL, but this could also be a local install of SQL Server. Another important thing to note is your query should be written in such a way that you can rerun it without the script crashing. Let me show you what I mean. Here is a little script that I'm going to execute, and I'll include this just for your reference. In here, I have an if object ID is not null, then I go ahead and drop that table. I am then free to go recreate the table using the create table. If I had not put the drop table check in here, then the second time I run this, it would actually error out because the table already exists. And that's what I'm talking about. You need to have this written in such a way that you can rerun this multiple times without breaking anything. All right, let's hop back to our PowerShell code. After I pass in that query, I pass in the server name. Now the server name is always going to be in the form servername.database.windows.net. Next, I pass in the name of the database, and then my username. Note the username is in the format of username at and the name of my server. I give it the password and the query timeout length, and with that, I can actually go execute this. And we get our little yellow executing debug log.sql. And there we go, it's been executed. Now the last thing I have in here is a simple write host that says, hey, we're done. As we wrap this up, I want to throw in a big caution. Azure databases can get expensive really quick, especially if you're running them in premium mode like we're doing in these examples. So what I've done is I'm going to include what we call a teardown script, and this will go delete the various things we've created. Now I have 3 separate variables here that controls what gets deleted. I have a drop DB to drop the database, and that's really the important one because dropping the database is what's going to save you the most money. Just having a server or a firewall there is very negligible in terms of the charges you incur. So what I typically do in a day-to-day environment is at the end of my workday, I'll set the drop DB to true, and I'll set drop SQL Server and firewall to false. And that way I just get rid of that database, I get rid of my charges, but the next day it's very quick to go reset up everything because the SQL Server and firewall already exist from the day before. So this can be very helpful in saving money on a day-to-day development basis. Of course, when you're done experimenting, you'll probably want to get rid of everything altogether. So you can leave all of these as true to go completely get rid of your database, SQL Server, and firewall. And this is pretty straightforward. We connect to the database. I use the same switch to determine my variables. We set our subscription, and then we get into the drop sections, and these are all pretty much the same. I check to see if the object I want to get rid of exists. If it does exist, then I call the remove commandlet to get rid of it. And that's the same for the database, the firewall, and the SQL Server itself. Well, I hope you found that useful. For more information or to contact me, code samples and so forth, just visit my website at arcanecode.me. Thanks for watching.